Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this month's Detect to Protect webinar. My name is Kim Schofield. I'm from Stamus Networks, and I'll be moderating our webinar today and managing any questions at the conclusion of our session. Today's webinar is going to be presented by Phil Owens. He is our Vice President of Customer Solutions, and we also have Mark Durrett, our Chief Marketing Officer. I just wanted to, a few housekeeping items, remind you that the webinar is being recorded. We will send an email out early next week of the recording and the slides and also some additional information. That'll go out early next week. And so we're also going to take some questions, but would ask that you would hold those till the end of the webinar. Use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type your questions in, and we'll take them when we finish up. All right, I'm going to go ahead and then hand things off to Mark. I think you're going to start with us.
Right. Well, thank you, Kim. And thank you, everyone who joined. I want to start by telling a quick story because it's the reason we began looking into this in the first place. A high level, let's just start with, so we had a conversation with a high level threat intelligence practitioner at a government CERT, a friend of our company, Stamus Networks. And he shared with us that he was beginning to see activity from some nation state threat actors in which they were compromising network devices at the edge and lying quiet for months and sometimes years before acting. And they discovered this using a proactive threat hunting on some log data. And this customer had our NDR deployed, but not in the location where it could see that traffic. And so the customer was kind of upset that they hadn't yet expanded their NDR deployment to this segment of the network because he was convinced that it would have identified some of this activity much more quickly than his log analysis. And then within a week, a second organization that we're working with confirmed that they also had experienced similar attacks on their network infrastructure. And so these conversations led us to dig deeper and look into to see if this is really a growing problem. So Phil, could you kind of click ahead? So I guess the question is it a trend? And I would say that our experience and in our research, we've determined that the answer is a resounding yes. And so when we think of cyber attacks, we typically think of an attack that compromises a server, a database, a workstation, a laptop, or similar device to sort of access sensitive data or gain access to other systems. But what's happening is it's shifting. It's shifting from those systems to network infrastructure. So while they've traditionally focused on these endpoints, they appear to be shifting to a new entry point, the network infrastructure. Things like switches and routers and network access controllers, firewalls, domain servers, VPN appliances, etc. Once we consider those secure components, they've now become sort of battlegrounds for an increased number of vulnerabilities that are discovered and threats that are being attacked. And I guess the real problem here is that many organizations are not set up to detect exploits against vulnerabilities in these systems. And that's really, we're finding that's because they rely too heavily on endpoint-based threat detection and response systems. So really a better approach is needed. But I think if we can just jump, thank you, Phil. There's been a surge in these infrastructure vulnerabilities. It's really quite alarming. And the US CISA has documented a bunch of these in recent months. And, I'd like to just kind of share a few of these examples. So Juniper Networks just really recently announced a vulnerability in their Junos OS for some of their exchange systems. Phil, you want to just kind of click? Yep. So NetScaler, their application delivery controller, their security gateway, both of which they identified. In both of which they identified vulnerabilities recently. Um, what else we have, Bill? Ivanti. This one's become relatively infamous. Um, they release security updates for their policy secure gateways and their secure gateways. Um, and these have almost all been exploited. So here's another one. An exploit against Cisco, ASA, and FTD. These are known to have been exploited. Phil, next one. And then just last week, as written up in the register, um, China's Volt Typhoon was implicated in a break-in to an emergency network in a very large United States city in the United States, and these were tied to some of these that I just mentioned. Literally, the vulnerabilities that were exposed and publicly disclosed in the last month. So Avanti Connect Secure, VPN, Cisco ASA, they were part of this attack. And you can see in some of the other network appliances that were part of this. Fortinet, FortiGuard, so that's a firewall, right? Now, okay, so you can go back, Phil, there, thank you. So what's really cool though is this is not a new phenomenon. Um, in fact, Richard Betlich back in 2007 wrote this blog in particular, in his Tau security blog, about a vulnerability that was discovered in Cisco iOS. And so it's not a new thing, but what we're seeing is a huge ramp up in the number of these disclosures, and these in particular, those that have been exploited. So we're going to explore here in the next few minutes a little bit more about how this happens and why it's a problem. And so I'd like to hand it over to Phil to kind of walk us through some of those.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Mark, and great information. What I'd like to do is start by looking at into the network infrastructure, and what does that mean? What are we thinking about when we're talking about network infrastructure? So these are routers and switches, which you would expect, right? But it also includes firewalls, IDS, IPS, load balancer appliances, secure gateway appliances, right? Pretty much anything that's a purpose-built network infrastructure type of tool. And those could be, sensors. They could be anything that you're plugging a network cable into that's purpose-built to do some function for you. One of the interesting things, and one of the reasons I think that we're actually seeing a lot of these vulnerabilities show up and then these exploits taking place, is as time has progressed, these things went from very, very rudimentary. All I'm doing is switching traffic from one location to another without much problem, to very complex and high-end situations where they have modern operating systems installed on them. They might have just all kinds of things that are happening, and that's what's opening up the door, I think, from my perspective, on what we're seeing with regards to these added vulnerabilities and how they're happening so quickly and so over the relatively short term here in the last few months, even, right? Seeing how many are taking place and why that's escalating. So some of the common attacks that are leveraged here. So if there's a vulnerability found, or if there's an exploit that takes place, these are what we're seeing typically that's taking place. So remote code execution, which allows the attacker to actually get code and installed and actually run arbitrary code. This could allow for them to do some scanning for potential lateral movement. It could allow them to install malware or backdoors on systems, especially some of these pieces of infrastructure that have full modern OSs installed on them, even though they're classified as an appliance or as a purpose-built appliance. So they're also able to use this to compromise other machines, and even find other vulnerabilities within the network on other purpose-built appliances or network infrastructure. The other one that we see really big is denial of service attacks, right? So if they get on one of these systems, it becomes relatively easy for them to start denying traffic within it, especially on switches and networks, and stopping traffic from moving from in and out of the organization specifically. And then, if they're using lateral movement, actually being able to stop some of that traffic as well. So those are the two big things that we see attackers doing when they're infiltrating these pieces of infrastructure. Some other things that will notice is buffer overflows in order to be able to get into that remote execution mode or denial of service, but also privilege escalation. And from here, they're actually able to pull actual credentials that may be used if it's shared across multiple devices for that lateral movement. And then one of the other pieces that we've seen is some firmware tampering. And this is something that we've seen more and more from a ICS or a IoT perspective, where the attacker may be uploading firmware to these devices that have backdoors or malware built into them. So why is it a problem? I mean, these systems have visibility typically into critical areas of your network, right? So because of that, if they're able to capture some of that data that's flowing through these systems, it's very conceivable that they have the ability to get into other locations, because they'll be able to map out and do reconnaissance easier based off the data that they're looking at. The substantial attacks can be launched from these as a beachhead position, right? So they start here, get in, and then work their way through trying to find the golden nuggets that they're looking for within the network. And again, because they have visibility into a lot of network traffic, they're able to map out the network a little bit easier. And then because typically we don't think of these devices, or haven't thought of these devices as insecure, right? We're not always looking for these exploits. So they can go undetected for a very, very long time. And some of these are edge devices where maybe you don't have access to that traffic because they are actually literally right on the edge. An NDR a lot of times will be deployed inside of a firewall, but if the firewall is on the outside and it gets exploited, what data are we seeing from that perspective? So they can go undetected, and by long time I mean months, even years. When we were talking to the customer, when they went back and were looking at some of this, they did find potentially things for a couple of years ago that they probably needed to take care of. I don't think that they were actually breached, one of the customers, but they did have a hold of an edge device. The attackers did. So getting into how do we detect and respond, right? And what are the alternatives that might help from this perspective is where I want to go next. And we'll talk about three main locations, or three main things that you might use for this. I'll start off with log analysis. So log management, a SIEM, an XDR, data lakes, log aggregation tools, whatever. And then we'll go into EDR and NDR as potential ways to look at these and what some of the pros and cons are. So from a log analysis perspective, as was mentioned, we were talking about SIEMs, things like QRadar, Logarithm, Splunk, although I kind of consider Splunk a log aggregator, and XDR, right? A lot of people think of XDR as an extension to EDR, but in its truest sense, it actually is very similar in nature to a SIEM, being able to collect data from different locations as well as just the EDR. So the purpose of a log analysis tool, right? Analyze logs from all servers and network infrastructure equipment and all data that you possibly can, whether that's Windows machines, wherever you want to get those logs. That's one of the purpose of log analysis. Now, They provide analytic tools to correlate information from multiple sources, right? And what's really interesting from that perspective is they're able to take that data from multiple sources and normalize that data so that it is in the best state for like a unified data model to allow for searching and correlating to be able to find conceivably bad things. But logs are also something that aren't just for security, right? But it helps practitioners extract some insights, so get insights, as well as known bad behaviors and even anomalies. So that's really where log analysis takes place. So I mentioned some of the how, right? All devices and applications of interest can ship logs to a log analysis tool, and that tool will parse and normalize all the data, which provides for easy query and analytic functionality. Interestingly, from a unique capabilities perspective, logs are sourced from devices that may not be monitored by other solutions. So you can't install a lot of times an EDR on a network infrastructure solution, but they will generate logs for you to monitor, right? Logs sources can also come from the other two that we were just communicating with. So in typical deployments, you'll include sources, making this tool great for actually correlation of data and for applying artificial intelligence. So you could actually get your logs from your NDR, your EDR, your network devices, everywhere that you're trying to do. And because you have all of that, you have the data that can be utilized for applying advanced analytics. The other thing that is interesting from a log perspective is since it's generated by the actual device that's being monitored, they can include things that maybe an NDR, for instance, can't pick up, like internal errors and warnings that are not seen outside of the device. That can be delivered as part of the tool as well. So this is really some of the unique capabilities of utilizing log analysis to try to find some of these exploits that we just talked about. Now, some of the limitations, right? If we're actually getting the logs from the device that has been attacked, an attacker could conceivably manipulate those logs, feeding the analytics tool, making it look like everything is okay, even though there's something going on within the system. So that's something that's been seen from some of your advanced persistent threat actors out there, where they actually have the ability to manipulate the logs on the tool once they get on the system. Sending logs requires a path from the device being monitored, and that path could be potentially to an internal system and could be used for lateral movement, right? So just keeping that in mind, because the logs have to get to a log aggregation system to then be sent off into a SIM, there is a path into the actual network. All of that's done via IP and TCP/IP. So it is a possible way for lateral movement to take place. And then due to some licensing and sizing of log analysis, it's sometimes used for more than just security, right? So to get the biggest ROI, we see a lot of times that operations will use the information in order to do their work, and you get a couple of teams within the organization together to try to offset from a budgetary perspective what the licensing costs might do. But because all of that extra data is being put into the system and it's not being used specifically for security, you can really dilute the data with information as well. So just keeping that in mind, and one of the conceivable limitations, you're not only diluting the data, but you're also picking and choosing what data that you're actually going to be delivering into the system. And that has to do with some of the sizing reasons, right? You could end up with petabytes of data if you're collecting everything, and then licensing for that petabytes of data might be something that turns into an eye raise, if you will. All right, so that's log analysis, and one of the things that we could use for detection and response. And as was mentioned by Mark earlier, one of the people that we talked to, that was in fact how they found something, but they had wished they had their NDR in place. But next place that I'm going to go is into EDR, or endpoint detection and response. So any device that connects and communicates to the network is an endpoint. So that's what we're talking about here. And that includes the network infrastructure tools that we were just talking about, as well as, laptops, desktops, tablets, mobile devices, basically anything that can grab an IP address on the network, or even just transfer data between networks. Those are all items that could be part of that. That includes industrial control systems, IoT devices. We have a customer that actually is monitoring gas pumps. We also have seen ATM information. So things like that can be on the network. And all of those, anything that's connected to the network, whether that's wireless or via a wire, would be considered an endpoint. So the purpose of an endpoint detection and response system is to record and store endpoint system data and behaviors, deliver that to a central management or central analytics tool, and use various data analytics and techniques to detect suspicious system behavior, provide contextual information, block malicious activity if it's seen, provide remediation suggestions. All of those are things that are happening. What's really nice from an endpoint perspective is the type of data that it sees. So some of its unique capabilities, that detailed endpoint visibility and threat detection. You can see things like process trees. You can pull memory dumps, look at CPU utilization and what's going on within the OS, with what's going on the system itself. All of that data is very, very very good to use from a detection perspective. And you can really do rapid threat remediation with a tool that has that deep insights, including some of the network connectivity that it sees, like IP address that's going to, and things like that. So it enables behavioral analytics, who's logging in, when they're logging in to the particular system where the agent is located. All of that can be done, as well as forensic analysis, like I was just talking about, being able to pull memory dumps, being able to pull process trees, check file system changes, as well as file system file modifications on the different modification dates. All of that can be seen by an EDR running as an agent on the system. There's also some idea of being able to do rollbacks of certain aspects of the system as well. So all of that are some of the unique capabilities that the EDR has. Now, some of the limitations is you can't install it on every device. And this includes a lot of network infrastructure devices, right? I did mention that some of the newer gateway appliances and things like that, they will have a modern OS, and it is conceivable to install an EDR system on that device. I would probably say that most of them don't typically recommend doing that. They've purpose-built this gateway for certain throughputs and scalability, and certain with locking it down how they think is the best way to lock that system down. And putting an EDR on it becomes a little bit of overhead, as well as a potential issue from a support perspective. So you can install it on every device. You can install it on some network infrastructure, but you're not going to install them on switches and things like that. So just keeping that in mind. Endpoint agent installation is required. And if you have thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of systems, right, managing that becomes really, really just a lot more difficult. Because now your central servers are all going to need to be able to manage, the agent installation on every single device. So one of the limitations from that perspective. False positive and alert fatigue. I think a lot of your detection and response tools can have some of this impact, including the log information that we were talking about before. So just very typical from a limitations perspective on any device. We haven't gotten perfect at detecting everything, so sometimes we deliver more alerts than we might want to. We are doing we are doing better as we keep moving forward. The potential of performance impact and even user impact, and so by user impact, that includes the whole idea of productivity, right? So the impacts on performance could cause the user to even try to do things like remove the endpoint. I've seen that happen many, many times where they're like, well, as long as this thing's running, I can't get my work done. So I've decided to figure out a way, going to Google or wherever, how can I get rid of this endpoint off of my machine? So we've seen gaps happen just because of that, even on machines where endpoints are able to be deployed and are deployed. There are some, in Europe, there's some privacy and data protection issues that we've seen happen where, because of the fact that they have access to all the data that's on the system, and that data, a lot of times that central server happens to be in the cloud as a SaaS system. And that data is then being sent outside the network to the SaaS infrastructure for the central server part of the deployment. And then obviously skills and resource requirements in order to be able to continue to monitor and operate, especially in a very large environment with tens or hundreds of thousands of deployments. All right, so that's some of the EDR pieces. And then finally on the NDR, network detection and response, I want to talk a little bit about what it is. So here, data is derived from network traffic, right, to identify and respond to potential threats. It can use machine learning, behavior analytics, and signature-based detection techniques based off of that data, and employ prioritization or triage techniques to identify critical threats. So try to cut down some of that noise. A typical IDS, for instance, delivers tons and tons of things, and this goes back to the alert fatigue. But NDRs were built to try to help remediate some of that alert fatigue by utilizing the network security monitoring data, or all the protocol transaction data, as well as flows and other information, and bring that down to something that's actually usable. And they can be used for notifying personnel or trigger automated response with integrations with third parties. So there's two approaches that are used for NDR. One of those is the DPI approach, or deep packet inspection, where it's actually looking at live network traffic to feed various detection engines and extract files, flows, packets, metadata from protocol transactions that I was just mentioning. And then there's the flow approach, where there's a central analytics engine that extracts all the network flow logs from various network devices and applies the algorithms to detect suspicious activity there. So some of the unique capabilities in the NDR field is no agents are required. So you can actually get detailed information across the network, and most of your malware has to communicate somewhere in order for it to get its commands from command and control, or in order for it to execute what it's trying to do. It's usually utilizing some type of network connectivity to happen. So this allows for detailed visibility into those device communications. Most of the time, an NDR is actually deployed as a passive monitoring type of solution, so it requires no impact to the network. So if something were to happen and the NDR goes down, the network continues to function. So whereas other solutions, there could be some situations where parts of the network could go down, or machines themselves could be impacted. It does have a really good view of lateral movement and detection that way. So if you're deploying some of these sensors in the proper locations, you would be able to see movement that's happening from a lateral perspective. And it gives you a really complete view of the crime scene. And what I'm saying here has to do specifically around the network infrastructure piece that we were just talking about. If I can't deploy EDRs to the network infrastructure, so my agent's there, this will give you a complete view of what's going on with that crime scene, especially one of the NDRs that are using deep packet inspection. And then as a bonus, it can be used for operations to look at network performance as well as any hygiene insights or any policies being violated on the network. Things like that are able to be used. Some of the limitations. So the DPI approach, for instance, which gives you the most data, it actually relies upon some of the network infrastructure that we were just talking about that are being targeted. I mean, it's going to require a mirror port from a switch. It's going to require a packet broker or tap, right? So all of those things are part of what's required in order to be able to get the DPI information off the network. The flow approach, while it does not necessarily have the same requirements there because you already have in place some of that network infrastructure that's producing the flows, it's working with extremely limited data, right? So you're not getting the parsing of protocols and the more sophisticated data that could be used for detection of really bad things that are happening, right? Encrypted traffic requires sophisticated algorithms, and so what that means is really the fact that if it's encrypted and it's on the wire, it's hard for us to decrypt it. So we need some sophisticated algorithms to understand what the traffic actually is, and that's by monitoring handshakes as well as generating JA3s, JA4s, those types of things, looking at cipher suites, SNIs, whatever data that we can actually pull from encrypted traffic. It does require sophisticated algorithms, but it also doesn't mean it's useless in those types of scenarios. Just to keep that in mind, a lot of threat intelligence is actually written specifically for the amount of data that can be gotten from encrypted traffic. Scalability and performance, particularly for east-west monitoring. So keeping that in mind, east-west traffic, a lot of times your trunks on your network are way bigger than your north-south traffic trunks or the ability to get to the internet. You might have 10 gigabits per second to the internet, but you might be operating 40 or 100 gigabits per second east-west. So that can become a scalability issue as far as deploying all and getting all of the traffic from the east-west area. It is good for lateral movement, and scaling and performance on that east-west traffic at really high speeds can be a limitation for some NDR vendors. False positives and negatives, just going back to the same thing that we have with regards to EDR, even the log information. These happen, and there's not a whole lot that we can. We work hard to keep them from happening, but they do happen. I also like to say that typically false positives aren't really necessarily false positives. They're actually something that happens on the network, but it may not be interesting to you. So it's generating a lot of noise that could be zoned out or turned down. And because of that noise and these false positives and negatives, you may not look at the data as hard as you would like. And then very limited endpoint visibility. So the network does not have access, obviously, to the process that's actually running, the process that's running on the machines that an endpoint agent could be deployed on, and seeing that process that's actually doing the communication across the network. It can see the communication, but it doesn't actually know what is doing that communication. There are some data points that can be pulled to help try to identify that, like user agent information, but really to have that truth on the endpoint, an agent would be good for that, and then correlating that data with network data. All right, so the next thing that I want to just really quickly talk about are what are the key takeaways that we were just looking at. So we don't think that the endpoint system is really going to help with network infrastructure attacks, at least not very well. Most of these systems you won't be able to deploy an agent to, and even the endpoint security system hosts communicating with the infrastructure elements just don't see the network activity as well as other things might. So this creates, as as we put a BABS, right? A big blind spot. I won't say it out loud due to the audience, but it does create that with all of the network infrastructure. So if you're relying only on input data, endpoint data, we think that that's going to not be able to get you the visibility that you're going to need for these types of infrastructure attacks. Organizations that are concerned about network infrastructure, typically what we would consider, what we would suggest is deploying an NDR, preferably a DPI NDR, as it gives you the most visibility, as well as a log management, right? And standing up some proactive threat hunting practices. So interesting, like I mentioned before, from a log management perspective, it's really nice to be able to take enriched data from an NDR on the network, deliver that into a log management system that can also get data from other locations, like the logs from the infrastructure devices, and do correlation so that you can really break down what might be going on from an attack perspective. Because NDR operates out of band, so I mentioned that endpoints are on the endpoint, right? As well as log management has to have some type of communication to get the data into the log management tool. NDRs can actually be air-gapped, so they really can't be manipulated. So the NDR may get traffic on a promiscuous mode, just be sniffing the traffic, but they operate out of band, which allows them to a lot of times not be manipulated like we were talking the log management tool could be. So those are some of the key takeaways that we have from the presentation. From here, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark, and he's going to talk a little bit about Stamus Networks and what we do. So Mark, it's all on you.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Good stuff. So while we're not here to sell you anything today, I do want to take a minute to introduce you to Stamus Networks for those who aren't familiar. And thanks for switching the slide, Phil. So some of you may not know us, and we're a nearly 10-year-old company, headquartered in Indianapolis, United States, and Paris, France. We have offices in 8 different countries, and we're really focused on helping elite enterprise defenders to uncover serious threats and unauthorized activity that's lurking in their network. And this is particularly relevant to the conversation today. Some of these network, these threats and attacks against these network systems are also often just lurking and lingering in the network for months and years. We were recently recognized by Gartner in their 2022 NDR market guide as one of the representative vendors. Our roots are actually in open source, and in particular with Suricata, the leading open source network security engine, and our high performance network-based threat detection and response system, which we call Stamus Security Platform, is built on top of Suricata. And it's really, to help enterprise scale organizations to protect their organizations using their network. The Stamus Security Platform is trusted by some of the world's most targeted organizations. You can see a few of those categories here, including government certs, central banks, insurance providers, managed security service providers, financial services, government institutions, etc. And we're super proud of the adoption from some of these really critical organizations. Okay, so Stamus, I mentioned we're a leader in Suricata-based network security, and that has like 3 primary dimensions here. The first is our team. We've got a team that's been developing and evangelizing Suricata for over 10, 15 years, and we've contributed more than 10 times more to the Suricata code base than any other nearest contributor. So our co-founders are on the board at the OISF, which is the organization that governs Suricata. Next, thanks. And as I mentioned earlier, Suricata is at the foundation. It's the engine inside the Stamus security platform. And because we do know so much about Suricata, we're able to eke out much of more of the capabilities of Suricata than anyone else. We've been able to build machine learning and signatures and IOC matching and algorithms on top of the Suricata, and provided a platform for threat hunting. And then lastly, we really believe in the community, the Suricata community, and are frequently contributing back to that community with tools. We've developed 6 really popular open source tools, and including Celts, which is a turnkey Suricata deployments downloaded over 1,000 times a month. And we've written a book on Suricata, and it's an open source book, actually. So a lot of commitment to this community, and we believe in it, and we have benefited really from that participation. Okay, thanks. Real quickly, the architecture. So the Stamus security platform consists of 2 different components. One or more network probes, which you can see at the bottom of the diagram here, that can be deployed throughout the network, where they passively monitor the network traffic. They perform deep packet inspection on the live traffic for automated threat detection and evidence collection that can be used for threat hunting and incident response. Most of our customers use a network tap or packet broker to direct a copy of their network traffic into these probes. Now, the probes relay detection events and lots of metadata to the Stamus central server, which you can see at the top of this diagram. That Stamus central server aggregates the security events from the probes, actually performs another layer of detection and event triage, and it serves as the user interface for integration, or for the users, and the integration point into other elements in your security stack. So we can integrate, for example, with an EDR to trigger an automated response or quarantine an endpoint, and send logs up to a SIM or a central logging console, or even trigger an IR ticket. So both the probe and the central server can be deployed in the on-premise in your network, or in the cloud, or both. They can be deployed on your bare metal servers or virtually. And yeah, so that's sort of the overall architecture of the system. And what our customers are seeing, Phil, if you'll flip to the next slide. They're really getting a complete network-based threat detection and response system, because what we're doing is we're combining the best capabilities, the best elements of a modern NDR with some of the complete functionality of some legacy tools, including intrusion detection and network security monitoring. And so we believe that we've solved most of the limitations that Phil covered in his section earlier about NDR, particularly by dramatically reducing and eliminating concerns about false positives and those performance limitations that he mentioned. So users get greater visibility into threats and activity, and we do that by deploying multiple detection technologies and providing a guided threat hunting console. So you'll uncover sort of even the weakest attack signals and unauthorized activities. We're big on being super transparent with detailed evidence, so you can understand exactly what triggered an event and get a complete timeline of the activity. You can use our Stamus network probes, or you can actually deploy your Suricata sensors. So we can supercharge sort of the capabilities of those existing Suricata deployments, and then help you transition to the more powerful Stamus network probes over time. Super open and extensible. And it's really built for enterprise scale. And I think this last piece is important too, the optional on-premise analytics. We're not a SaaS platform, and that's by design. Many of our most targeted customers are subject to excruciating privacy guidance and regulations, and they're not comfortable shipping even their telemetry metadata up into someone else's cloud application. So our customers deploy the central analytics console in an environment that's under their control. So anyway, that's all I got there. Oh, thanks, Phil. Yes, so I've just got a few resources that can help you get a better handle on this whole thing. We're going to share this presentation at the end, so I'm really not going to go over all of these. The first of these is a bunch of resources around these types of vulnerabilities at MITRE and at the CISA, and some articles, recent articles. And then, as this slide depicts, you can see that we've got some materials on Stamus Network's website that I think can be super helpful here. That's really all I've got, guys. Hand it back over to Kim, who will manage the Q&A if anyone has submitted any questions along the way.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to both of you for that. All right, so as I mentioned, Q&A function is down at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. You just type your question in and we will take those. So I'll give everyone, I have a couple of questions already, but I'll give folks a few more minutes to ask any separate questions. All right, let me start with this one. Okay, so Phil, aren't there some appliances where you can install endpoint agents?
Yeah, so like I was mentioning, there are some appliances or purpose-built appliances that are meant to do things, and some of those I've noticed, like Barracuda, for instance, will allow you or work with or integrate with an EDR vendor and allow you to install on their purpose-built devices. Because again, they're purpose-built, but that doesn't mean they don't have a modern OS on them, and being able to deploy to them sometimes is something that a customer will want to do. So yes, there are, however, some that don't have that capability from a deployment perspective.
Okay, so got a couple more questions here. So the next one is kind of two questions in one from the same person. Is the probe a separate instance from the server, and where do you collect the logs?
So the probe is a separate instance. So if I go back to the screen here that was showing, the probes actually are separate from the Stamus Central Server. And the Stamus Central Server includes the ability to collect the logs. It also can send those logs via syslog off to a SIM or a log aggregation tool, so that can be done. So they are definitely separate. Most of the analytics are actually happening on the probe and then delivering the alert and event data, all of that to the Stamus Central Server from that perspective. So.
Okay. Thank you. So next, how do you deploy the software?
So the Stamus security platform is actually delivered as appliances. So when we talk about that it could be done only in software, that's typically meaning a virtual machine ISO, or in the case of ESX, VMware, we do create OVA files, but we are deploying these as purpose-built appliances, right? So that is what they are. And we do keep our operating system up to date as part of the update model. So now, with that said, for those of you that might be interested, Selks is a Docker download, and you can get the information on downloading and installing Selks on a machine from our GitHub page. So but the Stamus security platform itself is delivered as appliances.
Thanks,
and again, appliances could be software appliance, not necessarily physical appliance.
All right. I have another one that speaks to kind of the specific threats that you went through in the presentation. Can NDR accept third-party threat intelligence to detect those threats?
Yeah, so a lot of times when some of these network infrastructure tools are exploited, the companies will put out information about IOCs to look for on the network to see if you've been exploited. And absolutely, the Stamus security platform can, in fact, utilize that data and trigger alerts or declarations of compromise, as we like to call them, based off of that data. And they would be custom for that particular system. We also keep up to date with CVEs with regards to that. So a lot of times you can do a search for CVEs within the system, but absolutely we can take in typical IOCs to be able to alert you on the possibility of one of those exploits being in your network.
Okay, great. Thank you. I did have one other one. Do we also sell hardware?
And yes, we do sell the hardware if that's something that's required for the deployment that's happening.
Great. All right. That is it for questions. I can give folks a few more seconds. I'll just go through a reminder that we will send out the recording, the webinar slides, and then we'll have some additional information and links to additional information in an email that will go out early next week. So keep an eye out for that. All right. I do not have any other questions.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I think with that, we can bring the webinar to a close. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.